since it's about halfway through the lecture series for, actually we're a little bit more than halfway through, I thought it would be good to just kind of recap and talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going into the second half of the lecture series. So we started out hearing from activists and authors, Charles Ray, who took us on a tour of the Salmon River watershed. We then heard a talk by Tim Palmer, who's spent a lifetime in advocacy. He's also an author and photographer. So we heard a lot of personal story woven into the celebration of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And then we kind of transitioned into more of a scientific perspective with Alan Watson. And again, last week with Mike Fiebig, we wove in both a bit of personal story. He talked a little bit about his own campaign that he's building to bring awareness to wild and scenic rivers, and also he shared with us the stories of sentimental value of rivers to people across the country and even the world. He had a few international stories in there. So this week, I am really excited to introduce Scott Bosse, who's going to be speaking this evening. He's the Northern Rockies Director for American Rivers. So we heard from Mike, who was also with American Rivers last week. You're Mike's boss, right?
Yeah, he said his talk went pretty well, but I need to check with you guys.
Yes. Do you have any feedback for Scott on Mike's talk?
If anyone has any criticism, let me know privately.
So when I was putting this lecture series together, I really wanted to have somebody speak about legislation that's currently working its way through Washington, particularly in Montana. We have a bill that's working its way through for the East Rosebud to be designated as wild and scenic. And I called Tester's office, I called Dane's offices. I asked both of them if they had a staffer that they could have come talk, and their staffers who would be the ones speaking both said that it's a campaign year and so things are busy, it takes a long time to get approval processes through, but you should really try to get Scott from American Rivers to talk. So Scott was already on my list, but you also had the endorsement of both political parties here in Montana to be our expert to talk a little bit about legislative history. So just to give you a little bit of background on where Scott comes from, as I said, he's the Northern Rockies Director for American Rivers, which is housed in Bozeman. He spent 20 years as a conservation advocate working to protect rivers and fisheries at the state, regional, and national levels. Prior to opening the Northern Rockies office for American Rivers 9 years ago, Scott spent 9 years as the Director of Aquatic Conservation for the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and 5 years with Idaho Rivers United, which is a statewide river conservation group based in Boise. And we heard a little bit about Idaho Rivers United from Charles Ray, who was our first speaker. He's been leading wild and scenic river campaigns in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho for the past 15 years. In 2009, he spearheaded the passage of the Craig Thomas Snake Headwaters Legacy Act, the most sweeping wild and scenic rivers bill to pass Congress in a generation. And specifically, when I talked to Tester's office, they had mentioned that they were really impressed with the way that piece of legislation had moved through in the state of Wyoming, and was one of the reasons why they recommended we have Scott here at the lecture series. Scott holds a master's in environmental studies from the University of Montana and a bachelor's degree in geography and political science from the University of Vermont. Tonight's talk is titled Saving the Last Untamed Rivers in the Northern Rockies Using the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And Scott's going to take us on a bit of a journey since he's been involved in everything from the inception of a campaign regarding the wild and scenic river designation all the way to seeing it through to signature on the president's desk. So really excited to welcome Scott to our lecture series. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Is this working okay? Can everyone hear me? All right. So I actually took this class 25 years ago. I'm dating myself. It was one of the tougher classes I took. My favorite class was recreational river systems. I'm not sure if they're still teaching that at the University of Montana, but the final exam, you had to float the wild and scenic stretch of the upper Missouri, and that was a bruiser for sure. How many of you, before you heard Mike Fiebig's talk last week, how many of you had heard of American rivers? Raise your hand if you had. Okay, so like half, 2/3, something like that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about American rivers before I get going, and then Natalie, I'll ask you to turn down the lights after I get through with this first slide. So American Rivers was founded in 1973 by a group of river rats in Denver, Colorado, who had spent their lives exploring the rivers of the West. And what they were seeing in the early 1970s is all of the great major rivers in the West had already been dammed or were proposed for damming. And they didn't think that every last river should be under human control. So they put down together, I think 4 of them, put down $200 on the table, said, let's form a group. They called it, I think, the American Rivers Conservation Council. And that was the birth of American Rivers. And our original mission was to add new rivers to the newly created National Wild and Scenic River System, which was created in 1968. So American Rivers grew from 4 dirtbags sitting at a table in Denver to what is now about 80 employees scattered around the country. More than half of us are in the West now. We've got about 275,000 members and supporters, about a $20 million budget. And that sounds like a lot, but we're actually one of the smaller national organizations. And we really focus on 3 things. We focus on protecting wild rivers, and one of the ways we do that is through wild and scenic river designations. We restore damaged rivers, and the major way we do that is through dam removals. So American Rivers, since 1973, has been involved in removing 200 dams across the country. Some of them were as high as this table, and some of them were 220 feet high. It cost $350 million to remove. And this year, I actually just read our latest report. American Rivers helped remove 86 dams. So 2017, actually more dams were removed across the U.S. than any year in our history, which is something we take some pride in. And then lastly, we protect wild rivers, restore damaged rivers, and conserve clean water for people and nature. So essentially, we work with communities to meet their water supply needs, hopefully without building large new dams and reservoirs. So we use creative ways to come up with water supply to nourish people and communities. So with that, Natalie, if you could turn down the lights. The way I'd like to run this presentation, it's not really an hour and 20 minutes long. It's probably 40 or 45 minutes long. If you have any questions of clarification or short questions during my presentation, just blurt it out, please. I invite you to. Don't save it to the end. And let's save any kind of bigger loaded questions that can prompt a discussion to the end of the presentation. Does that work for you guys? Awesome. So you've probably seen a map like this before. I think Mike probably showed you one like this before. So I know you've heard 75,000 dams have been built in the US, 80,000. It's really an estimate. But these are dams at least 50 feet high or higher that have been built across the country since 1776. So that's the equivalent of building 1 dam a day every day since our nation's founding. That's how many dams the United States has. So together, these 75 to 80,000 dams have impounded about 600,000 miles of rivers across the US. So that's about 17% of all the river miles in the United States are impounded or affected by dams. So you've probably heard the creation story about the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, right? Have you seen this slide? Something like it? Okay. So this is a special year. It's the 50th anniversary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. We like to say we're going to bring the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act home where it belongs because it was the famous wildlife biologist brothers John and Frank Craighead who were doing wildlife research near Glacier National Park in the 1950s when our good friends at the Army Corps of Engineers wanted to build a 400-foot high dam on the middle fork of the Flathead River that would have flooded the entire southern boundary of Glacier National Park. Because the Craighead brothers had done wildlife research for their whole careers, they understood more than most people the value of low elevation river corridors to wildlife. It's really where wildlife congregates. And the more arid regions in the country that you go, the higher the dependence that wildlife have on river corridors. Some studies show that 80% of all the bird and mammal species in the western US depend on river corridors for at least half their life cycle. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was really a wildlife protection tool. It wasn't really a river protection tool. Rivers were just the habitats that created the wildlife habitat. And so the Craighead brothers came up with the idea for the Wild and Scenic River System in the mid-1950s. They first proposed it at Montana State University in a lecture in 1957, and then they lobbied across the country for 9 years. They gave talks like this, they gave talks in Congress, they testified before congressional committees, and then in 1968, led by Senator Frank Church from Idaho, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act passed Congress and was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. So again, the reason why the Craigheads wanted to come up with a wild and scenic river system was to protect low elevation habitat. And they were also working with the forefathers of what would become the Wilderness Act, which passed in 1964. And the Craighead brothers understood that the Wilderness Act was really going to be targeted at a lot of rock and ice, this high elevation habitat that's really pretty to look at, it's really enjoyable to hike in and ski in, climb in, but it's not the richest wildlife habitat in the world, unless you're a pika. So you've probably learned a little bit about what the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does and doesn't do, but I'm going to reiterate those because maybe after hearing it from 8 different lecturers, you'll understand what it does and doesn't do. The first thing, and the major thing that the Act does, it bans new federally licensed dams. And that's an absolute. It's really the only absolute part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And every river that's protected as wild and scenic, there can be no federally licensed dams built on that river. The second thing the Act does, it protects and enhances water quality. And so that means, let's use Rock Creek as an example, because I'm sure a lot of you guys go to Rock Creek. If Rock Creek was designated as wild and scenic this year, the Forest Service would assess water quality the same year it was designated. They'd find out what all the water quality parameters were, and that water quality, the date of designation, would have to be maintained. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does not demand that every river that's designated be restored to a pristine condition. It just has to be maintained at the same level that existed at the date of designation. The third thing, a river that's protected as wild and scenic gets a federally reserved water right. Okay, but that's only for the minimum amount of water necessary to retain that river's special values, or outstandingly remarkable values is what Congress called them. And that water right for a wild and scenic river is junior to all existing water rights. So if you're a rancher, an irrigator, a farmer, and you're concerned that a wild and scenic river is going to dry up your water rights, that is absolutely not the case. Those are junior water rights. And the fourth thing the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does, it ensures that a river's outstandingly remarkable values, or ORVs, are maintained. And each river has different ORVs. For Rock Creek, the ORVs would probably be recreation, fisheries, wildlife, and maybe scenery. Other rivers have cultural values, geologic values. There's even one river in the Midwest that has literary values. So each river has unique, outstandingly remarkable values, and those values have to be maintained. And so that means, we'll use Rock Creek as an example again. If scenery was one of the ORVs on Rock Creek, and someone wanted to build a huge cell tower that was like 200 feet high in one of the prettiest places of Rock Creek, and it marred the scenery, then that project either couldn't happen or it'd have to be modified so it no longer affected the scenic values of the creek. And last but not least, a wild and scenic river requires a comprehensive river management plan. And for those of you that read the Missoulian Much or the Flathead Beacon, the Three Forks of the Flathead, which are 3 of Montana's 4 wild and scenic rivers, they're just starting to undergo a comprehensive river management plan right now. And that CRMP guides management activities along those rivers for the next 20 years. So the Forest Service will actually amend their forest plan by including this comprehensive river management plan, and it'll say things like, you know, motorized boating is or is not allowed on this river. Timber harvest is or is not allowed in the river corridor. There'll be certain things about mining, perhaps. on rivers that are really, really busy, have huge recreational use, the agency might say, we're going to impose a lottery system because overcrowding is becoming a real issue and it's impacting the recreational value of the river. So a comprehensive river management plan is really the roadmap that governs management of the river for the next 20 years. And it's a great opportunity, if you happen to live on that river, to give your input on how you want your river managed. Some people that we talk to, they're paranoid about any new national designations on our rivers. We like to tell them, if your river is designated as wild and scenic, you actually get much more of a say in how that river is managed than if it was not designated as wild and scenic. And that's through the Comprehensive River Management Plan. Okay, so what the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does not do. Right? First thing it doesn't do, it does not condemn your private property. Government's not going to come and take your house away, although we've heard that from several people in Montana. The way the law was written, actually, any wild and scenic river corridor that consists of more than 50% federal public land, there can be no condemnation by the government. That means the government cannot take your house, move it away, and move you to a different place. So in virtually every case across the country, and especially in Montana, the opportunity for the government to condemn private property is non-existent. It's never happened in Montana, it never will. And as a matter of fact, on all the Wild and Scenic Rivers bills that I've participated in and I helped write, we state that explicitly. There shall be no condemnation. So that's really clear, hopefully. Also, when a river is protected as wild and scenic, that does not mean that the federal government gets to impose planning and zoning. The federal government does not all of a sudden say, hey, you can't build this cabin, or you can't build this outhouse, or you have to paint your house blue. All of those things are issues that are left to local governments, and the federal agency that manages that river has no say in it whatsoever. Third, private property value. Some people mistakenly think that wild and scenic designation might decrease private property values because they couldn't subdivide or build an additional house. Hopefully I just dispelled that myth. In fact, in most cases where there are private inholdings along a wild and scenic river, the private property values increase because you've got an insurance policy that the river that you built your house on and that you love so much is going to stay that way forever. Also, it doesn't change public or private access. So in a wild and scenic river corridor, the public is not shut out of public lands. The public is not allowed on private lands. Whatever access situation existed at the time of designation remains. Water rights are not affected. So if you have water rights for irrigation or any other use, those remain senior to any wild and scenic water right. And then last but not least, fishing and hunting are not impacted. So fish and game laws in Montana and every state across the country are left to the states, not the federal government. So there would be no such situation where a river is designated wild and scenic and all of a sudden the government says there's going to be no elk hunting, or we're going to shrink the elk season, or we're going to shrink the fishing season. Those things just don't happen on a wild and scenic river. So I probably should have had this slide first because you're supposed to lead with why. Why would you protect a river as wild and scenic? If you have something like Rock Creek or the North Fork Blackfoot or, the Dearborn, the Smith, you have all these amazing rivers. Nothing seems wrong with them. They might not face an imminent threat. Why protect it as wild and scenic? Well, the first reason we tell people, because if you love it as it is, you probably want an insurance policy. You want to know that it's going to stay that way. So one of the things I always tell people is if you love something, don't take it for granted. So if you love your house, you get homeowners insurance. If you love your family, you get life insurance. If you love your river, you get wild and scenic designation. Also, because protecting intact rivers is a heck of a lot cheaper than restoring degraded ones. You'll probably recognize that scene. It's the confluence of the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork. So the cleanup on the Clark Fork from Butte down to Missoula is going to total, I think, about $1.3 billion. It's a 120-mile long stretch of river. It comes out to about $8.3 million per river mile to restore the Clark Fork. Okay? It's awfully expensive. It's a worthwhile investment because I think we can make that river great again. But protecting a wild and scenic river before it's degraded usually costs about $2,000 or $3,000 a river mile. So when we get rivers protected in places like Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where buying a 1-acre lot on the Snake River might cost $5 million, we can permanently protect that for about $2,000 a river mile. So it's a really great investment. The traditional reason why rivers were designated as wild and scenic is there was an imminent threat of a proposed dam. And that's the way everything was done kind of in the 1970s, the 80s, even the early 90s. That's why East Rosebud has its own wild and scenic bill right now, because dams have been proposed on East Rosebud 3 times over the last 20 years. Fourth reason, to create a native fish sanctuary. And as we talk about the Wyoming bill, the Snake Headwaters Legacy Act, the reason why we came up with that campaign is because we recognize that all those rivers that drain into the headwaters of the Snake River by Jackson Hole are the last great unprotected native cutthroat trout refuge in the interior West. And we wanted to find a way to protect all those important rivers and streams as one watershed. And so we got the first watershed scale native fish sanctuary created with that legislation. Another reason, some communities like to bolster sustainable tourism. You see that with some wild and scenic rivers. And then other communities, they really don't want any more people to come to the rivers, so they don't really market the wild and scenic designation. The way I like to do wild and scenic designations is we get a big group of rivers, so not all the attention is focused on any one. And frankly, what we're seeing is that visitation and recreational use does not increase measurably at all on any new wild and scenic rivers where you have a bunch of them designated at one time.
What do you mean by sustainable tourism?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I said loaded questions at the end. Sustainable tourism would be forms of tourism that can coexist with the wild and scenic designation without undermining the values for which it was designated. So, it could be rafting, could be kayaking, could be fly fishing, but it is not going to be recreational dredge mining for gold. It's not going to be jet boating, which undermines the solitude. It's not going to be any activity. Zip lines, we see zip lines being built over the Gallatin River right now. I would not really call that sustainable tourism because that undermines the scenic values. So those are maybe some examples of sustainable tourism and non-sustainable, but it's a gray area for sure. And last but not least, you protected a river's wild and scenic to give local people more of a say in how the river's managed. And it's not really intuitive at first, but when people really understand that, they gravitate a lot more towards protecting rivers. So, how does a river get designated as wild and scenic? We actually took this 3 weeks ago. We go to DC about 2 or 3 times a year to lobby the members of Montana's congressional delegation about protecting Montana's rivers. So in most circumstances, it takes an act of Congress to protect a river as wild and scenic, and then the president has to sign it. One of the reasons we went back to DC a couple weeks ago is to make sure when the East Rosebud bill passes that the president signs it, and we were assured that he would. Not completely sure I believe that, but the other way a river can get designated as wild and scenic, and this only exists in states that have their own state-protected wild and scenic river system, which Montana does not have, is the governor of a state can petition the Secretary of Interior to designate the river as wild and scenic. Okay, so there are 34 states across the country that have a state-protected river system, and in those 34 states, the governor of the state can ask the Secretary of Interior to add a river or rivers to the National Wild and Scenic River System. One thing that I did not include on this slide, but I probably should have, is before we even introduce any sort of wild and scenic river bills, groups like American Rivers, American Whitewater, the Clark Fork Coalition, a lot of river groups, we engage in the forest plan revision process. I know that sounds really exciting. The Lolo Bitterroot's about to start their forest plan revision. But it's during that revision process where the Forest Service identifies which rivers and streams in the forest are eligible for wild and scenic protection. And that's a form of administrative protection that lasts as long as the life of the forest plan, so usually about 20 years. So typically on a national forest in Montana, we're working with the Forest Service to protect 200 to 400 river miles in each forest as wild and scenic eligible. That also tees them up to get protected as wild and scenic via an act of Congress. because the members of our congressional delegation always ask us, well, what does the Forest Service think? Or what does the BLM think? And if those agencies have already weighed in and found those rivers eligible for designation, it gives them a much better chance of passing as part of a bill. Okay, this is one of my favorite maps. It's called a cartogram. And this map is created in a way where each state in the US is drawn proportionate to how many wild and scenic river miles it has protected. So if you're like Nevada or Maryland or Rhode Island or Indiana or Oklahoma, you're a total loser because you don't have any. You'll notice that the states with the most wild and scenic rivers are Alaska first, then California, Oregon, Michigan, Idaho, and Montana's number 6. But what I want you to notice is if you look at the size of Montana and you look at the size of New Jersey, they're the same size, all right? So Montana is really underperforming. Given how many amazing rivers and streams we have, it's just crazy to me that we're the same size as New Jersey or Pennsylvania. And that's not a cut on those states, but we're a lot bigger and we have so many amazing rivers. So I'm going to spend a good part of the rest of my talk showing photos and telling stories about rivers that have been protected in the Northern Rockies or are about to be protected. And this is just an overview map that I clipped from the rivers.gov website. And if any of the previous speakers have not mentioned that site, it's really a treasure trove of information about wild and scenic rivers, just rivers.gov. They have a map you can download of all the wild and scenic rivers in the country, and this is just a screenshot of the Northern Rockies. And you'll notice that pretty much all of our wild and scenic rivers are in central Idaho. So the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, the Frank Church River No Return, up in the Flathead, so the crown of the continent, and then around the Snake Headwaters, see if this actually works, right over here. And this is the bill that I worked on for 7 years. The Owyhee Canyonlands were also protected in 2009. I wouldn't really call that in the Northern Rockies, but it's a recent addition to the wild and scenic river system. And you'll notice that Oregon has a ton of wild and scenic rivers. And that's not because they necessarily have better rivers than Montana does, and California has a ton too. It's because they have better politics for passing wild and scenic rivers legislation. And when you looked at that last map, that cartogram, the biggest states with the most wild and scenic rivers didn't necessarily have the best rivers. They had the best politics for passing wild and scenic legislation, and that's really important to recognize. So I'm going to take you on a tour of some of these rivers. How many of you guys have been on a salmon river trip? Raise your hand. That's it? Man, you guys need to get out. Salmon River is awesome. It's a 5 or 6 day trip through the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness. This was not one of the original 8 wild and scenic rivers, but it came relatively soon after, in 1980. And the Salmon River is the second longest free-flowing river in the lower 48 states, the first being the Yellowstone, exactly. Notice how I said free-flowing, not necessarily undammed, but free-flowing. The middle fork of the Salmon River, okay, if you're going to do one river trip in your lifetime in the lower 48, this is the one to do. It's an amazing trip. The middle fork was one of the 8 original rivers designated in the 1968 Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. It's about 100 miles long before it flows into the main Salmon River. It's probably got the most intact assemblage of native fisheries left maybe anywhere in the United States, barring Alaska. I mean, as far as native Chinook salmon, sockeye, steelhead, bull trout, cutthroat trout, whitefish, sculpins, it's probably the most intact watershed we have left in the lower 48 states. The Snake River in Hell's Canyon. Again, this was not one of the original ones. It came relatively soon after. But Hell's Canyon is the deepest river gorge in North America. It's almost 8,000 feet deep. It already has 3 Idaho power dams in the upper part of Hell's Canyon. But the lower reach is still free-flowing. I can't remember for how many miles. It's probably about a 5-day float, so probably close to 100 miles of free-flowing water. The wild and scenic designation of the Snake River through Hell's Canyon prevented the High Sheep Mountain Dam from being constructed. And that was proposed for just upstream of the mouth of the Salmon River, it would have inundated almost all of Hell's Canyon under 500 or 600 feet of water. So the wild and scenic designation of the Snake River through Hell's Canyon preserved this gem. The Lochsa, you have to have floated the Lochsa. It's only like an hour drive from here, right? Or don't you go there to watch the carnage over Memorial Day weekend? You watch everyone flip their rafts in Lochsa Falls? If you haven't, you should. Lochsa is one of the original 8. So if you look at the original 8 rivers in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, they list the Middle Fork Clearwater, but that actually included the Lochsa, the Middle Fork Clearwater, and the Selway. That's all part of the Middle Fork Clearwater. And the Lochsa is definitely a whitewater gem. And for those of you that were around here over the last 5 years, you may recall that the state of Idaho wanted to allow the transportation of these huge megaloads bound for the Canadian tar sands along Highway 12 along the Lochsa River. And it was actually the fact that the Lochsa was a wild and scenic river that convinced a federal judge to ban the state of Idaho from allowing those megaloads through the corridor, because those megaloads would have stopped traffic, they would have parked at all the campsites during the daytime, and they would have impacted the scenic and recreational values of the Wild and Scenic Lochsa River. So that's a real novel way that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act can protect rivers. It stops megaloads. The Selway is an amazing river. It's probably the toughest permit to draw in the country if you want to do a multi-day float. There's only one launch a day. So that means when you launch your raft or your kayaks in the Selway, you're going to be the only person, your party's going to be the only party you see for 6 days. It's got outstanding fishing for cutthroat trout. There's a lot of bull trout in there, great swimming, some hot springs. There was a dam proposed there by a place called Penny Cliffs on the lower Selway. Pretty much every river in the lower 48 states and pretty much every river I'm going to show in this presentation had a dam proposed on it back in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. And what I will say is pretty much every river that remains unprotected is going to have a dam proposed on it in the 2010s, 20s, and 30s. That's what climate change is doing, and that's what the fast-growing cities in the West are doing. Okay? Las Vegas, Salt Lake, Boise, Los Angeles, Denver, they're all out of water. Guess where they're looking? Montana, the last great untapped fountainhead in the West. That's where they're looking. Speaking of Montana, I'll take you on a tour of our 4 wild and scenic rivers. This is the upper Missouri, from about Fort Benton down to Judith Landing, where the Judith River meets the Missouri. This is a fantastic do-it-yourself trip. If you haven't done it before, you can run up to Fort Benton, stay at the Grand Union Hotel, which is the coolest hotel in the state of Montana. Rent your canoe for, what is it, like $30 a day. You can split it with a friend, so it's $15 a day. Float the river for 4 or 5 days. You can do a bunch of fishing. There's actually some slot canyons along that section of the river that remind you a lot of southern Utah, if you like that sort of thing. It's an amazing stretch of river for historic significance, for scenic beauty. I don't see a ton of wildlife there, but the Native American presence along that river is really amazing. If you hike up to any of the canyon rims, you can see teepee rings in a lot of places. There are pictographs on a lot of the rocks there. It's a really special river. By the way, you may remember if you read the Missoulian, Rob Cheney actually did a great series for the Missoulian on the 40th anniversary of Montana's 4 wild and scenic rivers. That was last year, and that's Rob in the stern of the canoe there. So the North Fork Flathead, another one of our wild and scenic rivers. This was threatened by the proposed Glacier View Dam back, I believe, in the 1950s. The North Fork was also historically threatened by open pit coal mining, oil and gas drilling. It was designated in 1976. Max Baucus was actually a freshman member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and this was his first major legislative campaign, was to protect the 3 forks of the Upper Flathead. And I talked to Max about that once in a while, and he says it was one of the proudest achievements in his political career. And of course, if you really, really love fishing and backcountry solitude, Clinton, you've been on the South Fork, right? The South Fork Flathead is unparalleled in Montana. Or if you like pack rafting. Anyone pack raft here? Raise a hand. Natalie, so you know how good it is. So you can actually hike in to the headwaters of the South Fork over Lodgepole Pass from Ovando in one day, inflate your pack raft and float for 5 or 6 days down the South Fork, camp at the tributary mouths and have just absolutely amazing fishing, great solitude, great wildlife viewing. It's an amazing river. Unfortunately, it does have one huge dam on it, Hungry Horse Dam, but the Wild and Scenic Reach is upstream of Hungry Horse Dam. And ironically, the reason why the South Fork still has all of its native fish species is because Hungry Horse Dam stopped all of these invading species coming up from Flathead Lake from infiltrating the South Fork of the Flathead River. So it's kind of an accidental refuge. And then the Middle Fork of the Flathead River, which I'm really psyched I'm going to float this July. And that's, again, where the creation story for the Wild and Scenic River system happened. It's also the fork of the Flathead that has the most whitewater. It's got some solid class 4 whitewater and really good fishing for native cutthroat trout. So those are all rivers that were protected decades ago. The next kind of chapter in my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some campaigns that culminated in 2009. And interestingly, when you said that John Tester recommended that I come speak to your class, the day the Omnibus Public Lands Management Act passed, which included a lot of Wild and Scenic Rivers bills, John Tester was the presiding president of the Senate that day. And he gave me one of his famous, one of these when I was up in the mezzanine. So he presided over the Senate approving these next 3 Wild and Scenic bills I'm going to talk about. And the first was the Virgin River in Utah. If you've ever been to Zion National Park, the Virgin River cuts the Narrows, which is a world-famous hiking trail. It's like I think it's about an 11 or 12 mile long slot canyon in Zion. Utah had no wild and scenic rivers prior to 2009. But the late Senator Bob Bennett, who passed away a couple of years ago, he really wanted to promote economic development in Washington County, where a lot of these rivers are located. It was the Virgin River and 36 tributaries. And as a compromise with conservationists, they passed a bill called the Washington County Growth and Conservation Act that designated new wilderness, new wild and scenic rivers, and actually transferred some federal land to Washington County so they could promote economic growth adjacent to developed cities. So that was a classic compromise piece of legislation led by someone who I would call a moderate deal-making Republican. And unfortunately, he passed away because there's not many of his ilk left in the US Senate. So Utah got 169 river miles out of that bill. So the Owyhee River in southwest Idaho, it's a pretty amazing place. And if you were just at the level of the land, walking in the grasslands, you would never know that these huge cracks in the earth exist with these spectacular rhyolite canyons. But it's just about an hour and a half south of Boise. These rivers have about a 2-week floating season during peak runoff. And you better hope it doesn't rain when you're out there because the roads are bentonite clay and become impassable. But the Owyhee Canyonlands Initiative, that was the name of the campaign, it became legislation because there was a history of lawsuits between conservation groups and livestock grazers in Owyhee County. And there was a lot of economic uncertainty, and the ranching community really did not like that uncertainty. And so Senator Mike Crapo, who's still the senior senator in Idaho, brought various people to the table, including conservation groups, ranchers, county commissioners, and said, let's hammer out a land use plan for the Owyhee Canyonlands that we can all live with, that will allow traditional activities like cattle grazing, hunting, fishing, some mining, to allow to continue, but also preserve these national treasures at the same time. And interestingly, Mike Crapo's idol was Dan Kemmis, who's a former mayor of Missoula for a long time. And Dan Kemmis is often credited with really creating the collaborative movement that exists today, for better or for worse. And the collaborative movement is where a senior elected official convenes a bunch of people and says, if you guys can come up with a land use plan for this special area, then I will carry legislation in Congress to protect it the way you want me to. So that was really Dan Kemmis's idea that Senator Mike Crapo in Idaho carried the ball on and got 16 rivers and streams, and about 320 river miles protected in 2009. Another part of that Owyhee Canyonlands bill was the Bruneau River, which is about 40 miles long. I floated this with a good friend of mine who's a paraplegic, and he somehow convinced me that this was just a mellow desert river, and we'd drink lots of tequila, and just it's going to be a chill outing. And I really didn't do my homework and found out that there's one rapid called 5 Mile, which is 5 miles of continuous class 4 with a paraplegic and a wheelchair strapped to the back of the raft, so that was pretty exciting. Fortunately, we didn't flip. But really spectacular rivers down there, and that's all rhyolite. It looks like frozen chocolate. Those canyon walls are really amazing. They're like 500 to 1,000 feet high the whole time you're floating down the Bruneau River. And so this is the Snake River in Wyoming, and everyone thinks that the Snake River flowing beneath the Tetons should have always been protected, ever since Ansel Adams took the famous picture, right, in the 1940s. This is like America's most scenic river. But it actually wasn't protected until 2009. And I'll go ahead and show this map. This is a campaign that I actually started from Bozeman, and I was working as a fishery biologist and knew the native fish values of the Snake Headwaters, and knew that it was the last big unprotected watershed containing all native cutthroat trout. And so we convened a group of people in Jackson, Wyoming in 2003 and came up with this ambitious plan to protect an entire watershed for the explicit purpose of creating a native fish sanctuary. At the end of the day, we got a bill that protected 13 rivers and streams, 412 river miles, basically from Yellowstone National Park in the north, all the way down to the Hoback River and down south of Jackson in the south. It was the biggest wild and scenic rivers bill to pass Congress in a generation, and it was the only watershed level bill to pass. I'd call it the only genuine watershed level wild and scenic bill to pass. I mean, it was the explicit purpose. It has an interesting story behind it, and I've only told this in public one time before, but I figured since I'm back home at the University of Montana, I could tell it again. And this is kind of the story of sausage making. You've heard that analogy with making legislation. So we actually got Wyoming's senior senator at the time, Craig Thomas, to introduce this bill for us, because he had just been reelected. He was like 74 years old. He wasn't going to run again. And he and his wife were looking to leave a legacy. And they grew up on a guest ranch in Wapiti, Wyoming, just outside Yellowstone National Park. So, they're shopping for a legacy. We're kind of selling river protection. We're kind of like chocolate and peanut butter. We sort of hooked up and sold them on this idea of, hey, let's pass the biggest wild and scenic bill in a generation, and you can have your name on it. And Susan Thomas, Craig's wife, was super excited. And Craig was like, yeah, it sounds kind of cool. But we worked with his wife. So he picked up the bill. He chaired the committee in the Senate that the bill had to go through. So, and we hired his former chief of staff as our consultant. So we were playing the game. We were totally dialed in. We had this nailed down. So the bill gets introduced, and a month later, Craig Thomas died of leukemia. And we were like, you gotta be kidding me. We spent years building up community momentum to get this bill introduced. Our senior senator, who was in the perfect position, got it done for us, and he passed away of leukemia. So I remember being at home in Bozeman. I shed a few tears. I was walking around town, feeling sorry for myself, and a couple people that we hired to run this campaign with us, we had a call the next day. And I was like, you know what we're going to do? We are going to go to Craig Thomas's funeral in Casper, and we are going to talk to Susan Thomas, his widow, and we're going to convince Susan Thomas to meet with the governor at the funeral, because the governor got to choose Craig Thomas's replacement in the U.S. Senate, and we're going to tell him that he can only choose someone that will embrace this bill and carry it across the finish line. So the Republican Party in Wyoming, because Craig Thomas was a Republican, they got to nominate 3 finalists, and the governor got to choose the next senator. So one of the finalists was a woman named Cynthia Lummis, who was the treasurer in Wyoming at the time. She said, I'm not touching that stinking river bill. Another guy was from the oil and gas industry, Tom Sansonetti. Again, I'm not going to touch that stinking bill. John Barrasso became Wyoming's next U.S. Senator because he embraced this bill. And John Barrasso is the fourth most powerful Republican in the U.S. Senate today. And now, you know the rest of the story. That's how he got his seat. He agreed to carry this bill across the finish line for us. So it's kind of an interesting story. And there's actually more to it, which I won't go into until after class, if you ask me. It involves, I gave a talk on it once called Sex, Death, and Resurrection. Because the one senator that was blocking this bill from passing when it was first introduced was Senator Larry Craig from Idaho. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Larry Craig, just Google Larry Craig Minneapolis Airport bathroom stall. Okay, because Larry Craig ended up losing his seat in the Senate, and that was the one vote difference that we needed to get this through committee and pass. That's the sausage making. Oh, I actually didn't mean it that way. So again, I just wanted to emphasize that, that the Snake Headwaters Bill was the only bill in the history of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that was specifically targeted towards protecting native trout. And these are some of the rivers that were protected by the Snake Headwaters Bill, which got renamed the Craig Thomas Snake Headwaters Legacy Act. So this is the Lewis River in Yellowstone National Park. We're kind of working our way from north to south. This is the Buffalo Fork. Has anyone here heard of the Buffalo Fork? The Buffalo Fork of the Snake River. If you like fly fishing, it's a pretty awesome place to go. That far bank right there is loaded with 18 to 22 inch Yellowstone cutthroats. One of my favorite rivers. The Gros Ventre River. Again, that's obviously Jackson Hole in the background and the Grand Teton in the upper right. The Hoback River. You may have read about 5 years ago, there was a proposal by a Texas-based energy company called PXP, or Plains Exploration and Production Company. They wanted to drill 136 gas wells at the headwaters of the Hoback River and frack them. But because the lower Hoback River was protected as a wild and scenic river, we actually had a lot of leverage to show that if they conducted their drilling activities, it would impact the water quality in the wild and scenic reach downstream. And because we had that leverage, we were actually able to bring PXP to the negotiating table, and for $9 million, we bought out their oil and gas leases. They never drilled there, and Congress passed legislation to forever withdraw the Wyoming range, the mountain range where the Hoback starts, from all new oil and gas drilling. So it was the fact that the Hoback was a wild and scenic river that prevented gas drilling from happening in the headwaters. So that's another example of the power of the law to protect a river that we love. And then this is one of my favorite streams around Jackson that we got protected as wild and scenic. It's called Granite Creek. And about probably 8 or 9 of the streams that were part of the Snake Headwaters package look just like this. I mean, they're pristine, all native cutthroat trout, lots of wildlife, and not much recreational use at all on some of these streams. Pretty much all the recreational use gets focused on the Snake River through Grand Teton National Park. So the next chapter, I want to talk about which wild scenic rivers are coming up next. What's on the agenda? And a couple of them are they're not really full-fledged campaigns yet, but we've dipped our toes in the water. We've done some polling. We've spoken to local elected officials. And that's why I'm going to mention those rivers in this presentation. They're kind of teed up for a campaign. So the Upper Green, if you've seen the new Wyoming license plates, this is the scene that's on the license plate. It's Square Top Mountain on the upper right and the Upper Green River. Probably the second most spectacular river in Wyoming after the Snake flowing past the Tetons. The Upper Green was in the original Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, in the original bill, but Wyoming's 2 senators insisted that it be removed from the bill. And so it was never protected in 1968. And since that time, dams have been proposed repeatedly in this area, and it's an incredibly special place. There's more wetlands along the Upper Green River than any place in Wyoming, 174,000 acres of wetlands, so tons of waterfowl, tons of wildlife. There's a hot springs there with an endemic species called the Kendall Warm Springs dace. It's a fish about 3 inches long. It exists nowhere else on Earth. The Upper Green River is where the path of the pronghorn is. So all the pronghorn that migrate from Grand Teton National Park to the Red Desert in southwest Wyoming use this river corridor, as well as the longest mule deer migration in the lower 48 states uses the Upper Green River. So this is an exceptionally important fish and wildlife habitat. It's been threatened by dams. There were 2 dams proposed in 2015. We finally extinguished those. So it's perpetually threatened with really high values, so it's at the top of my list. There's a lot of rivers coming off the Absaroka Mountains, Absaroka Beartooth by Cody, Wyoming. Like the Graybull, the Wood, the North Fork Shoshone. These are all on public lands. They're all free-flowing, except the lower North Fork actually has a dam on it right by Cody. Lots of native fish, lots of wildlife values. Hopefully, a group like the Greater Yellowstone Coalition or Wyoming Outdoor Council will partner with American Rivers, and we can launch a campaign there in the coming years. I'm not going to tell you what. Oh, yeah, you had a question?
Go back to the upper green. How far down would that designation?
So that designation would go from the source of the Green River in the Wind River Range, so in the wilderness, down to Warren Bridge, which is the highway when you drive from Jackson to Pinedale.
Oh, okay.
You cross the Green River. So it'd be about 50 miles of river, all on public lands. Like I said, I'm not going to tell you which stream this is. This is my favorite place to fish in the lower 48. But it's on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And Indian reservations are one of the last frontiers for wilderness designations and wild and scenic rivers. I mean, I think the Mission Mountain Wilderness was the first tribal and maybe the only tribal wilderness in the U.S. Do you know, Natalie?
It was the first, and I guess technically it still is the only tribally owned wilderness.
And I don't know if there are any wild and scenic rivers on Indian reservations yet. Do you know?
The Kootenai up north here, they don't have a wild and scenic river, but they have that wilderness area.
Could be. That's Natalie's homework.
Yeah.
Wilderness lecture series, not wild and scenic. Anyway, so this stream is one of the ones we're looking at, and Badger Creek up on the Blackfeet Reservation is a really special stream, and we've actually met with the Blackfeet tribe about protecting that someday. Then in Idaho, there are some stretches of river that have been teed up for decades. There have been bills introduced to protect the lower Maine salmon as a wild and scenic river, but they have not passed yet for one reason or another. But this is an awesome float you can do from down near Riggins, Idaho, out through Hell's Canyon, and then you pop out near Lewiston, Idaho, and you don't need a permit to float this. So you just pick it up. You don't have to apply for one. It's a really fantastic float to do in September. The canyons of the Teton. So who can tell me why the Teton River Canyon is famous in American history?
Well, that dam blew out.
There you go. I knew you were going to answer that question. I've been looking at you. You just, Cadillac Desert. If you ever read Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner, there's a whole chapter on Teton Dam that the Bureau of Reclamation built in 1976, and before the reservoir could even fill, just months after the dam was completed, the dam had a catastrophic failure, and it caused massive erosion, wiped out the fishery in Teton Canyon. But in the intervening years, 42 years, that canyon has resurrected itself. It's an amazing place. It's where a lot of the elk and mule deer on the west side of the Tetons overwinter. It's where trumpeter swans overwinter, and it's one of the last best Yellowstone cutthroat trout refuges in eastern Idaho. And it's got 2 sub-canyons that meet it. That's Bitch Creek on the top, and if any of you fly fish, the fly called Bitch Creek is named after Bitch Creek, and that's Badger Creek on the lower right, which is all spring-fed, and it's just amazing. It's like looking into an aquarium. It's so clear. But that's on our list. And then the South Fork of the Snake River in Idaho. That starts at the outlet of Palisades Dam on the Wyoming-Idaho border, flows for, I think, 66 miles down to Heisey, Idaho. It's got a spectacular canyon. You can do a really nice 3-day float through there. Again, it's a really valuable Yellowstone cutthroat trout fishery. It's been called the richest wildlife habitat in the state of Idaho. There are 260 bird and mammal species in there. It's the largest riparian cottonwood forest in the entire western United States. So it is a very, very special place. The only thing I wish was different on the South Fork is jet boating started taking off about 5 or 10 years ago, and it's, I think it kind of interrupts the wilderness experience through that canyon these days. So what about Montana? You know, we haven't had a wild and scenic river designated since 1976. Before I talk about East Rosebud Creek, I want you to think about one thing. So I talked about bills that passed in Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah in 2009. So politically, tell me, what is a little different between Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah versus Montana? Blurt it out.
Politics, population.
What about the politics are different? Are they more conservative or more liberal? Those are three of the most conservative anti-federal government states in the entire United States. Yet, their congressional delegations unanimously supported new wild and scenic rivers. And when a group of us, mainly University of Montana grads, started a campaign to protect new wild and scenic rivers in Montana, what was the first thing we heard from a lot of our conservation colleagues? Oh, there's no way you can get it done in Montana. And we're like, are you kidding me? We did it in Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, and we can't do it in Montana? I said, that's ridiculous, and that's lazy. So we're going to launch this campaign, which is what we did in 2009. And the first river on our list is East Rosebud Creek. And that was targeted with 3 different dam proposals over the last 20 years. We organized the local citizens near Roscoe, Montana that live there. It's a lot of ranchers. They all support protection of East Rosebud Creek. We got every single member of Montana's congressional delegation since 2014 to support a bill to protect East Rosebud as a wild and scenic river. And that includes Ryan Zinke, Steve Daines, Max Baucus, John Tester, John Walsh, who was a senator for a very short time. So the East Rosebud bill is actually the only bipartisan wild and scenic rivers bill in the United States that's supported by an entire bipartisan congressional delegation from that state. It's really unique. And our goal with this is to prove that you can pass a wild and scenic rivers bill in Montana, and we're going to be alive after it's done so we can protect more of them. So I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about more of them. So several groups, including American Rivers, American Whitewater, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, Pacific Rivers, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, we all launched a campaign. Our coalition is called Montanans for Healthy Rivers. And if you guys aren't Facebook followers, you should be, because most of our Facebook followers are from Missoula. And we have a website, healthyriversmt.org. And our major goal, but not the only goal, was to protect at least 50 new rivers and 500 new wild and scenic river miles in western Montana. And the rivers are really focused on the crown of the continent, so around Glacier National Park and the surrounding environments, and then the northern end of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So just north of Yellowstone National Park from Red Lodge, pretty much all the way over to Bozeman and Ennis, and a lot of the rivers radiating off the Yellowstone Plateau. So right now we have a legislative proposal. It's actually to protect, I think, 52 rivers and almost 690 river miles. We have had a tremendous amount of public outreach over the last 8 years. We've met with over 300 different groups, like conservation groups, land trusts, recreation groups, business owners, chambers of commerce, Native American tribes, you name it, we've met with them. We have over 2,500 individual Montanans that have endorsed this proposal. We have over 1,000 Montana businesses that have endorsed our proposal. And we're feeling pretty good that in the next year or so, we're going to get a much larger wild and scenic river bill introduced in western Montana. And we've been talking to all 3 members of our congressional delegation about this for years. And these are just examples of some of our outreach activities. That's like a typical community meeting we have in the upper left. That's on East Rosebud Lake. And that was one of our launch meetings to protect East Rosebud Creek. That's the Boaters Bash outside the Thomas Marr Bar in Missoula. We sponsor that every year and try and have a little fun and get people involved in wild and scenic rivers. And that's a Senate field hearing we had in Billings back in 2014 that was really successful to bring awareness to the plight of East Rosebud Creek. And we've actually commissioned 2 different public opinion polls, scientifically valid public opinion polls. We asked currently only 4 segments of Montana rivers enjoy wild and scenic status. The last one was designated 40 years ago. Do you support or oppose permanently protecting more of Montana's rivers that flow across federal public lands using the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? And as you'll see, 2/3 of Montanans support it, 25% of Montanans oppose it, and 7% are too busy watching TV. But I could have added additional slides here to show the political breakdown, like by Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, Eastern Montana, Western Montana, older age people, younger age people. But I will just summarize because I didn't want to bore you with all those slides. It's across every demographic. There's a strong majority of Montanans that want us to bring the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act home where it was born. So here are some of the streams that we are proposing for protection in our legislative proposal. And these are the public land sections of these streams. So we're not looking at the private land sections that flow across ranch lands. So Rock Creek, basically from about mile 30 down to the mouth. North Fork of the Blackfoot River. I know some of you have been there. I know my niece has. Youngs Creek, okay, so Youngs and Danaher Creek join together to form the headwaters of the South Fork Flathead. This is one of the most amazing places in Montana. An incredible cutthroat trout fishery, and the solitude up there is amazing. If you go pack rafting on the South Fork, this is where you launch your pack raft. The White River, this is a tributary to the South Fork Flathead. It's about 25 miles long. Again, it's absolutely amazing fishery. You may not see anyone up there if you spent 2 days hiking up it. The Spotted Bear River, it's 32 miles long. Again, it meets the South Fork of the Flathead, an incredible native cutthroat trout and bull trout fishery. Over in my neck of the woods, the Upper Madison, which is threatened by a proposed hydro project it's more than a couple of years ago. It was about 2010. A power company wanted to dewater about half of the flow of the Madison River exiting Quake Lake down to Reynolds Pass where the bridge heads over to Idaho. We stopped that project, and now the Upper Madison is one of our candidates for wild and scenic protection. So no power plant or dam can be built on it. The Gallatin River, which was threatened, a lot of people don't know this, but there was a major dam proposed at Spanish Creek where Ted Turner's property touches the Gallatin River. That was back in the 1950s and 60s, and there's nothing to stop a dam from being built on the Gallatin today. The Upper Yellowstone. I'm showing this photo because it's a beautiful photo, but it's actually the section from Yellowstone National Park down through Yankee Jim Canyon that's a candidate for wild and scenic protection. And the biggest threat there over the years has really been dredge mining. There's a lot of dredge miners that are searching for gold in the riverbed, in that section of the river, and that's got tremendous public support. The Boulder River, this is another one of those rivers that flows off the Absaroka-Beartooth Plateau, goes north and meets the Yellowstone River at Big Timber. Then the West Boulder River. Has anyone here been to the West Boulder River? It's a damn nice river. This is the scene when you hike in. It's about a 2-mile hike to get to the spot. And this meadow section here, I mean, this picture doesn't do it justice, but it's one of the most amazing places in Montana. You should put it on your list whether you're fish or not. It's just so beautiful. There's a lot of grizzly bears up there, a lot of sandhill cranes. Really, really special place. And then the Stillwater River, which is just above the Stillwater Mine. It's a spectacular river that's probably a 30-mile long section from its headwaters to where it exits Forest Service land that's proposed for protection. And then the Smith. I mean, you cannot not include the Smith on any list of iconic rivers in Montana that deserve wild and scenic protection. So we've proposed about 12 miles of the Smith from from Tenderfoot Creek down to Deep Creek as a wild and scenic river. And as many of you know, the Smith is threatened by a proposed copper mine up in its headwaters, at the headwaters of Sheep Creek, which is the single most important wild trout spawning habitat in the whole Smith River system. And if we can get the Smith protected as a wild and scenic river, any mines that are proposed on federal public lands would have a hard time getting approved because they would diminish water quality which the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does not allow. And then the Dearborn River, which is still on my list of rivers to float. I haven't floated it yet. It's got about a 2 or 3 week window of opportunity in the springtime. But the Forest Service section of the river, as well as about 20 miles of private land, is in our proposal. And those private landowners are really excited about the prospect of getting wild and scenic status. So that's kind of a tour of some of the most iconic rivers that are in our proposal. And again, we're hoping that our congressional delegation works together to introduce a comprehensive wild and scenic rivers bill for Western Montana after the November election at some point. And like I said, we've been meeting with Republicans and Democrats. You know, we don't play favorites. Our goal is to get people across the political spectrum to embrace river protection. And when we do that, like we did in Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, we know that we're doing things right because we're not playing partisan games with our rivers. So what are some of the other river bills that are active in the US right now that could move in the next year or so? One of them is the Wild Olympics, and I have a particular fondness for this area. I worked as a fish biologist here for a couple of years, and there's about 16 rivers and streams that radiate out from Mount Olympus in the center of the Olympic Peninsula there that are candidates for wild and scenic protection. So the Elwha, the Hoh, the Queets, the Quinault, the Dungeness. There's a lot of fantastic rivers there that are certainly deserving of protection. The canyons of the Green River, and when I say the canyons of the Green, I'm talking the Upper Green in Wyoming, but I'm also talking about Gates of Lodore section, which is fantastic. I'm talking about the famous fishing sections A and B below Flaming Gorge Dam, Desolation Gray, and Cataract Canyon. And believe it or not, some of you may have heard about this Utah Public Lands Initiative, which was a really failed effort led by Representative Rob Bishop in Utah to resolve the fate of a lot of wilderness quality lands in Utah a few years ago. It turned out to be a really one-sided process where oil and gas got everything they wanted and conservationists didn't get enough of what they wanted. But even in that awfully lopsided bill that didn't go anywhere, Rob Bishop, who's the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, included more than 300 miles of wild and scenic rivers on the Upper Green in that bill. So we know that there's a political appetite to protect certain sections of this amazing river. And the Yampa River in Colorado, it's really the only major undammed river left in the entire state of Colorado. And I lived in Colorado for parts of 9 years. I'll tell you, when I go down there and work with my colleagues in the Denver office, they are like fighting over the crumbs. They're like, maybe we can get this 2-mile section of Deep Creek protected, but there's no other free-flowing rivers around here. I mean, for those of you that are from Colorado, you will understand that the notion of free-flowing rivers is something that really does not exist in that state. And when those people look at what we have in Montana, they turn green with envy. I mean, we really are the last best place when it comes to long, wild, undammed rivers. And I think I just have one more slide. I had to have a slide of my wife. Clint, quit yawning, we're almost done. If any of you are from Minnesota, in northeast Minnesota, in the Arrowhead on the north shore of Lake Superior, there's about 20 spectacular rivers that flow through the national forest lands there. We'd like to see a campaign get launched there. And I'm just going to close it with this slide. This is my favorite river in the entire world, the Alsek River. Starts in the Yukon and ends up near Glacier Bay, Alaska. And sometimes I lay awake at night thinking, yeah, what river do I want to protect next? And I hope after you complete this wilderness lecture series and you learn more about wild and scenic rivers, that some of you will become the leaders in the next wild and scenic campaigns in Montana and wherever you might come from. So I'm going to conclude my talk. It's a little early, so we have tons of discussion time. Natalie, would you mind grabbing the lights when you get a chance? So did you learn anything new, or did you just see a bunch of pretty pictures? Yeah?
I had a question about just like water rights along the river is, can water rights be bought and sold similarly to development rights or other types of property rights, or is it a completely different process?
It's a little different. Water rights are usually tied to the land. So now water rights can be leased though, and like Trout Unlimited and the Clark Fork Coalition both work with farmers and ranchers to lease water rights for certain periods of time. So water rights have to be put to a beneficial use, and it used to be where in-stream flows for the benefit of fish and wildlife was not a beneficial use. Well, it is in Montana now. And so nonprofit groups and even the state of Montana, so Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, can lease water rights to let that water flow down the river for the benefit of fish, wildlife, and recreationists.
When another entity leases water rights, do the water rights maintain their status as either junior or
Yeah,
senior?
yeah. But generally speaking, so one of the strategies to meet water supply needs in a place like Colorado where there's a water shortage is the Denver Water Board, they call it buy it and dry it. The city of Denver will buy the oldest ranches that have the oldest water rights. And the only reason they're buying the ranches is so they can take the water and pipe it over the Front Range to Denver. So it's called a buy it and dry it strategy. And if you like the culture of ranching in a place like Montana, that's not a very appealing strategy, but that's the reality in the southwest quadrant of the country right now. There's a lot of that going on. Yeah.
Is there generally more support for rivers that are threatened to be designated?
That's a great question, and it's really frustrating to me. So, people always want to save sockeye salmon when there's 4 left. But if there's 400,000 left, don't worry about it. So one of our goals with Wild and Scenic Rivers campaigns is to try and get away from the thinking, let's just protect the rivers that are imminently threatened, and instead, let's go on the offense, and let's protect 50 rivers at a time. And the reason why that's so much smarter is because once you get a river protected as wild and scenic, you never have to fight the same battles again and again and again. But if you have one river where one mine is proposed, it can suck up all the energy and resources of the entire conservation community trying to defeat one mine, one oil and gas drilling project. And once you've defeated it, if you get lucky, you're back at the status quo. So you haven't really won anything. So, but you're totally right. It's almost human nature, certainly in this country, to want to come to the rescue of things that are imminently threatened. And this is a frustration I have with certain funders of the conservation community. When you go to them asking for funding to proactively protect rivers, they're like, come back to us when it's threatened. And it just, economically, I compared, remember the slide where I compared the Clark Fork cleanup to protecting the snake headwaters? Wild and scenic protection for $2,000 a river mile versus remediation for $8.3 million per river mile. So it's a perception we have to change, but it definitely exists. Yeah?
You talk a lot about, like, you mentioned for all these different rivers that, we want to protect, that, like, then job well done,
Gonna put ourselves out of work.
But I feel like there's definitely, we know now that certain protections, like national monuments, the fight's definitely not over, so, let's say we're able to designate some of these rivers in wild and scenic, what's like the next step after that, when they actually come under threat again?
Yeah, it's vigilance. If you love a particular river, if you live along a particular river, you should be a member of the watershed group. And even if a river is protected as wild and scenic, you're totally right. It's not forever. If you protected the Bitterroot as wild and scenic, which I hate to say this, but it probably would never happen because it's almost all private land, and you guys probably know the politics of Ravalli County. It's pretty difficult for getting new environmental protections right now. Wild and scenic designation for the Bitterroot would not affect subdivisions and private property development along that river, and the riprapping and the levees, all of which harm the river, but none of which are really limited by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act doesn't comprehensively address every single threat to a certain river. It only addresses kind of federally permitted projects. So you still got to be vigilant. But to date, there have been a couple efforts to rescind short wild and scenic designations, so you can expand the size of a dam and it would raise the reservoir and flood part of a wild and scenic river that flows into it. Those have been defeated thus far. But given what's happened to our national monuments over the last year, you're totally right. You can't take anything for granted, and you got to remain vigilant. There will be, we're seeing all kinds of stuff happen for the first time right now. We never used to talk about national monument reductions.
I have a question. So you talked a little bit about some specific instances where the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act can be used to protect on-land resources or restrict uses in some ways. So I'm just wondering, is anyone in American Rivers working on either the Ambler Road project in Gates of the Arctic that's going to cross both the Kobuk and the Alatna, or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which the designation doesn't exist, but 4 of those rivers that go into the Area 1002 are recommended for designation.
Yeah.
Do you see that? Do you see the potential and the legislative precedent now set, or I should say the legal precedent now set, where you could potentially invoke wild and scenic to protect from those development projects?
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. So American Rivers does not have an Alaska office. It's something that I would really like to have. It's always a question of funding. But I would tell you that if you could get certain rivers that flow off the Brooks Range to the Arctic coastal plain protected as wild and scenic, I think there might be a few up there.
There's a few, yeah.
But that would definitely, so for instance, on any river that's a wild river, so that, I don't know if you had this in any of your talks, there are 3 classifications of wild and scenic rivers. Did you guys hear that from Tim Palmer? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, they all get protected, but wild rivers, which are basically in roadless areas, once they're designated as wild, you can't build roads along them, and they're withdrawn from mineral entry. So you can't drill for oil and gas or mine in those river corridors. So there are actually certain protections that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act grants that the Wilderness Act does not grant. So you probably didn't know this, but in wilderness areas, the President of the United States can authorize dam construction. The President has never exercised that authority before, but some people ask us, why would you go for a Wild and Scenic River designation in the Bob Marshall Wilderness? Well, part of the answer is to prevent future dams. Part of the answer is if there are any mining claims in that area, by protecting it as a wild and scenic river, you can't build a road in that corridor. All future mineral rights are extinguished. So there are additional protections that Wild and Scenic brings that the Wilderness Act does not bring. Yes, sir.
Regarding that, so there's 3 provisions in the Wilderness Act that the exploratory power the president has for water resources. Existing mining law is maintained, and then grazing rights are maintained. Does the Wilderness Act take precedent over grazing rights if, cattle are crossing through waterways?
So there is some case law with grazing in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, but this is what I'll say, generally speaking. Grazing is certainly not explicitly prohibited by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. If a river is designated wild and scenic, as long as future grazing occurs in generally the same places and the same number of AUMs, the same number of animals, then it's allowed to continue. But if a permittee wanted to quadruple the number of AUMs in a particular grazing allotment, and that would harm water quality by destabilizing stream banks, then the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act could stop that from happening. So generally, if an activity has been occurring, it can continue to occur, but if you amplify its use and it results in degradation, then it can be curtailed again. But there are plenty of wild and scenic rivers with grazing. There are actually plenty of wild and scenic rivers that have jet boat use. There's nothing in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that explicitly prohibits motorized use. That's a major difference between it and the Wilderness Act, and that's probably the major reason why it's so much less polarizing than the Wilderness Act is you don't have that whole issue of motorized recreation. Yes?
How wide is the river corridor, like area next to the river?
Great question. Did you guys not learn this yet?
We did, but Verena's visiting
Oh,
out of country.
awesome. Where are you from?
I'm from Austria.
Oh, great. My dad's parents were from Austria. So Wild and Scenic Corridor is generally a quarter mile on either side of the high water mark of the river. But the actual corridor can vary. So if you have a highway on one side of the river, and the river's like pinched, there's a highway between the river and the forest, the border of that side of the river corridor might just be the highway. And if on the other side, there's a bunch of valuable wetlands, then the corridor can be wider than a quarter mile. So the average width of a river corridor should be a half mile or 320 acres per mile over the length of that designated segment. But it can be wider where there are special values that need to be protected and narrower where those special values don't exist. But it's supposed to average 320 acres per mile. Yeah?
Does Highway 12 work that way since the highway's right there? Does that go farther out on the
No, the corridor actually includes Highway 12. And the state of Idaho was trying to argue that they had an easement when they built that highway that was exempt from the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And Judge Windmill, I think it was in that case, ruled that was not the case, that even though they had an easement, it was located within the Wild and Scenic River Corridor. We may see another test of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act with oil train traffic along the Middle Fork Flathead, because that's been a major concern that people in the Flathead have had, that with this increased oil train traffic coming from the Bakken oil fields over Marias Pass, that someday there's going to be a derailment and an oil spill into the Middle Fork Flathead. So interesting case law that Highway 12 case opened up. Yeah?
What do you think it would take to designate the ALSEC? Or what's like the political climate in Alaska for designating?
It's really interesting. I'll give you an example. So I met with our newest congressman, Greg Gianforte, a couple of weeks ago. I'd never met him before. And I know he fishes, but I know his politics aren't like, he just introduced a bill to release 240,000 acres of wilderness study areas and BLM lands, and I think 500,000 acres on Forest Service land. So his inclination is not necessarily to put new federal protections in place for lands. But every elected official can be brought on board for a price. And you just got to show them. You got to show them that it's good for them to do something. So if a politician feels like their weakness heading into their next election is they've just trashed the environment for the last 4 years, and they need some moderate Republican suburban women to vote, more votes from that group. And you pitch a Wild and Scenic bill to them, they might do the calculus, that might help me. So members of Congress, and this is probably nothing new to most of you, they don't necessarily do things because it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but it's the right thing for their re-election prospects. And every time we go into a congressional office, the one thing that Charlie Ray, your first speaker, was my original mentor in conservation. And Charlie told me in his big, booming Southern drawl, he said, "Scott, you just remember when you walk into that office, they don't give a shit what you're going to say. They want to know what's in it for me." And that is the absolute truth. So it's a psychological game. And when it comes to protecting rivers, who would have known that John Barrasso, who probably has a lifetime League of Conservation score of 0, would be the champion of the biggest Wild and Scenic bill to pass in a generation? Well, he did it because it was his ticket to the U.S. Senate. And so it's kind of cynical for me to say that. And when I say everyone can be had for a price, the price isn't necessarily money. It's kind of deal making. And it's a sad thing because in all the polling we do and all the conversations we have with people, it's really clear that Montanans absolutely love their rivers. Montanans really want to protect more wild and scenic rivers. But, you know, when you go to the 3 members of our congressional delegation, they don't all necessarily share that viewpoint. So you got to find the right key to unlock their door.
Is it kind of like a risk to as a delegate to like subscribe to Wild and Scenic River? Like,
You know, I don't think it is, but some of them do. I mean, you know, there's a small percentage of the populace in Montana, just like every state in the country, that you know, people just want government to be smaller. They want less government in our lives. They want to divest ourselves of federal public land and give it to the states or give it to private interests. We're never going to get those people on board. So we kind of just we try and prevent those people from lighting themselves on fire. We'll meet with them, we'll listen to their concerns, but we don't want them to light themselves on fire. All right? But you're not going to change their minds. But you know, we do polling a lot. And the reason we do polling is because when we meet with our elected officials, they look at the poll results because they're looking out for number 1. And they want to get reelected, usually. And if we can show that, you know, by 2.5 or 3-to-1 margin, Montanans want to protect more rivers. I mean, I remember the first time I presented polling information to Steve Daines in the Bozeman, or no, it was in the Minneapolis airport. We were going to DC to meet with him, and I ran into him in the airport. And we went over all the polling results. And, you know, that meeting was super easy the next day. He co-sponsored the East Rosebud bill. So those are some of the tools you have to use. Yeah?
Are there any cases of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act being used as, I guess, sort of like preemptive leverage to try to get small-scale dam removals to happen and saying, like, if we remove this dam, this river could be up for designation?
It's kind of fun. So here's an example. The Elwha River, so American Rivers worked for 30 years to get, and there were other groups like Trout Unlimited that worked with us, to remove 2 large dams from the Elwha River that had been there for about a century. Well, now that those dams have been removed, we have an additional 15 miles of free-flowing river, which is now a candidate for wild and scenic designation, because you can't designate a river that has reservoirs in it. So oftentimes, you remove dams, and then the river's a candidate for wild and scenic designation. Here's a weird story. Massachusetts, I think, has just one wild and scenic river. It's called the Taunton River. Anyone here from Eastern Mass? Okay, oh, good. Because the Taunton River is not a very pretty river, all right? But when Barney Frank was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, he was a very powerful member of the House. I think he was chairman of the House Banking Committee. His constituents that lived on the Taunton River did not want to see a natural gas power plant built on the shores of the Taunton River. And the Taunton River flows, it's like the Duwamish River near Seattle. I mean, it's not pristine. But he introduced a Wild and Scenic bill because under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, there are no federally licensed power projects, not just dams, you know, coal-fired power plants, natural gas plants. So they actually got the river designated to prevent a natural gas-fired power plant from being built on the banks of that river. So, yeah, the muckety-mucks in Congress find all different ways to get things done or undone.
I think we're out of time, so thanks, Scott.
All right. Thank you, guys.